Listen up. So, kiddos, we're going to talk about violence in the 60s because the violence in the 60s was unlike any decade we've ever had. And I'm going to give you 6 examples of issues that eventually led to violence in the 1960s. Things that happened. We should be able to pick up a few of these because of our lectures. Can anybody, I don't have any particular order, but can you think of anything we talked about so far in this class in the 1960s that was violent? Okay, let's start with that. We'll go to number 5. Political assassinations. You know, there are no don't put it in, if there are no specific order. That was just 5 on my list. So, but we'll talk about that. Political assassinations. Now, you talk about the Kennedy assassination, but you got to think about these political assassinations. There was more than just one. There was actually 4. What were the 4 political assassinations? What was the first one? 1963, JFK. Well, before that, how about a political assassination prior to that? How about Lee Harvey Oswald's assassination? So you had an assassination of an American president, 1963, President Kennedy, and you had the murder of his assassin. So you had 2 violent acts in one there. So under political assassinations, the first 2 were in 1963. You had the assassination of President Kennedy, and then you had the murder of his assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. The next one in 1968 in chronological order was Martin Luther King Jr., the top civil rights leader in the United States of America, maybe the world. And then the third one was in 1968 in June, the assassination of Senator Robert F. Kennedy. So you had 3 political assassinations in the decade of the 1960s. And if you get real specific, you had 2 in 1 year. And you had 3 in 5 years. Okay, so that was very unusual. When's the last time we had a political assassination in this country? A long time ago. So, political assassinations was one of the 6 issues that led to violence in the 1960s. What else was violent in the 60s? What's that?
Civil rights.
Civil rights movement. Very good. The civil rights movement. Violence and coverage of violent civil rights protests and riots across the United States came across televisions every night. You don't have to write these down, but Montgomery and Selma, Chicago. So the civil rights movement was an issue that led to violence in the 1960s. What was the most obvious violent thing that happened in the 60s? The Vietnam War. The Vietnam War. You had nightly news coverage of the Vietnam War, continued body counts reported back every single day on how many soldiers had been killed in Vietnam. What else was violent about the Vietnam War other than the war itself? Protests. Yeah, protests were very violent. So, I mean, the Vietnam War was obviously one of the issues that led to violence in the 60s. So we have political assassinations, we got the civil rights movement, we got the Vietnam War. How about what we talked about yesterday? Did the counterculture affect violence? And okay, let's save that one because that's gonna take me to the drug culture, which is the same thing. Let's save that one till last. Okay. Okay. Here's another one: the consumer culture. What's the consumer culture? Oh, what's consumer? You're a consumer. You buy stuff. So, the consumer culture contributed to violence in the 1960s. And you know what the main thing was? What were they making that was violent in the 1960s that influenced the youth, especially little guys? What? No? What'd you say, drugs? No, I mean little guys. What little guys play with in the 1960s? What was the big toy guns, Army men, G.I. Joe. I've got G.I. Joe's, several replicas up there, different ones. The old G.I. Joe. Boy, this is a big one. But this is the kinder version of the G.I. Joe. Because from 1964 to 1968, the G.I. Joe was an army man, full of army things. You could buy tanks. I mean, you can kind of see the replicas I have up there. They even got the different types. Some are in the Navy, some are in the Army. The original, and I have an original at home. I can't bring it here because it's worth too much. But an original G.I. Joe in 1964 in the box is worth thousands of dollars. And in the box is the most important thing because nobody kept the boxes. So if you have the box, is actually worth $200 or $300 if you just have the box in good shape. But anyway, the G.I. Joe was a big deal. It was sold. And they would stamp the copyright of the G.I. Joe on his hind end. Okay? So it'd say 1964, 1965, etc. Well, by 1968, and the issues around the Vietnam War, people were complaining about the G.I. Joe, so they changed it from the G.I. Joe, the fighting man, to G.I. Joe, the adventure hero. And this is an example of the adventure hero, where they had the fuzzy hair and the beard and stuff. The other ones were just straight soldiers. And I have one here. I'll kind of show you. They were even being racially equitable, because what do we have here? An African-American G.I. Joe, which actually looks exactly like the Caucasian one, except for the face is black and the body's black. But this is more what an original G.I. Joe looked like. This is a replica also, but this is what they came in. And they came in the box, as you see up there, and you can see the hat and stuff, and this is a replica, and instructions. This was the adventure hero, where they went away from the violence of the Vietnam War. But kids were playing Army, and they were having these, you know, these kind of toy machine guns, and the consumer culture was eating up this Vietnam War, and they were really providing kids an opportunity to be much more, okay, stand right there, over there, much more violent, okay? So the consumer culture. Okay, movies and music groups was another example of issues leading to violence in the 1960s. And you think nothing of this in 2018, because when you, nothing like a good shoot-'em-up, is there, fellas? Take your girlfriend to the movie and she wants to go to a love story. Well, you like a good shoot-'em-up. And they shoot, and there's blood and guts all over in these shoot-'em-up. Saving Private Ryan, a perfect example of that. We don't even think of that now. But back in those days, have you ever watched the old Gunsmokes or Bonanzas? You ever see when they shoot the blood squirt all over? No. Half the time when they shoot them in Gunsmoke, there's no wound. I mean, that just wouldn't have been acceptable. Well, all of a sudden, as the 60s came about, movies and theaters became much more violent than the decades before, showed much more gore and guts, but nothing, frankly, like you see today. And musical groups began to use both violent and drug messages in their music, which probably isn't much, I mean, that doesn't surprise you today when you listen to some of the stuff that's said. Interesting, the other day, my wife's getting a little bit hard of hearing. Don't tell her I said that, although she could watch it on the video tonight. But she is kind of getting a little hard of hearing, so we're kind of into the closed captioning during movies. Well, I'm probably hard of hearing too, but I'm too proud to think that I need closed captioning. But it is kind of helpful when you watch the movie, because I like to catch all the details, you know what I mean? But anyway, so there's this song playing the other day before this movie. Oh, what was the name of the movie we watched? Denzel Washington was in. He was killing everybody. I mean, it was pretty unbelievable. But anyway, this music comes on, this kind of rap music, and of course, what do they do when you have closed captioning? All the lyrics come up, and I mean, it's F this and S this and all this, and my wife, who would have never heard that, or paid attention, just listening to the music, goes, oh my God, you know, just one after another. Well, it was in the 1960s that they started putting these type of violent and drug messages into their music, and it influenced kids and caused some violence. So we talked about the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, movies and music groups, the consumer culture, political assassinations, and our last one is the counterculture / drug culture. The counterculture / drug culture. Now, I am not promoting in any way any of you to be interested in any of these drugs. I'm just telling you what drugs were available in the 1960s. Unfortunately, as we mentioned yesterday, some of these have made a bit of a comeback, okay? Well, the first drug to talk about in the drug culture of the 60s is obviously marijuana. If you do not know how to spell that, I will spell it for you. It's on the ID sheet. Perfect, okay? Now, I'll tell you a little bit about marijuana when it started out. It was first outlawed in the United States in 1937. 1937 is when marijuana was first outlawed. And it was really not discovered until the 1960s when America's youth discovered that as a way to get high. Way to get high. That was the term used in the 60s. Might be the same today, I don't know. Now I'm going to give you 4 specific advantages that the youth culture saw in marijuana. And it's probably not any different today, although I haven't been out of the market lately. So anyway, marijuana had specific advantages for the youth culture in the 1960s. Number 1, at the time, it was very inexpensive and very available. So that was an advantage to the youth in the 1960s. It wasn't hard to get because there was a lot of supply and it wasn't that expensive. People could afford it. Now, I don't mind telling you about what I did in my life. When I was in college, marijuana was pretty prevalent, and I never used a lot of marijuana. There was a lot of it available, but at the time, I didn't have enough money to pay for it, you know. I was more interested in buying beer, frankly. And so if you had to make a choice, you know, that wasn't my choice, but there were a lot of people that made that choice. Another advantage of the youth culture using marijuana in the 1960s, it was widely acceptable among the youth. Everybody's doing it. What's your problem, Tigner? Here you go, buddy. Oh, no, no. Oh, what are you, some sort of a loser? Bill Clinton even said, when he was running for president, that he smoked marijuana, but he didn't inhale it. That's what he said. Well, the reason he said that's because he didn't want people to think he's... I mean, he might as well, if he decided I smoked a joint every day in college, he probably got more votes in today's society. But my point is, I mean, it was very accepted. If you weren't doing it, you were kind of... A lot of people say, you know, I wasn't interested in that at the time. Did I try it ever? Sure. Did I indulge in it much? No. Like I said, I couldn't afford it, and it just wasn't my thing. But it was widely acceptable among the youth of America in the 1960s. Also, it heightened a person's form of perception. Heightened a person's form of perception. What in the world does that mean, Taylor? If it heightened your form of perception. Or you could maybe perceive things differently. You ever watch, you guys probably don't watch, you ever watch, Days and Confused? Well, I didn't watch that one, probably been there. I see you and I are different. What was the one with David Spade and Chris Farley? Black Sheep.
Oh,
Black Sheep, when they, was that the movie where they were sniffing the nitrous oxide, and they were all of a sudden you was seeing the bug hit the window and all of that? Well, that's perception. Okay, you seen it? That's perception. That's heightening a form of perception. Okay, and marijuana had that effect on kids. And it also broke down inhibitions. Broke down inhibitions. What does that mean, Olivia? If it breaks down your inhibitions? Kind of, yeah. So I'm going to make Olivia get up here and give a speech to Senator Barrasso about everything that she learned in AP US history on Monday. And she's going to be nervous. So to settle herself down, she might have a beer or drink, you know, smoke a marijuana joint to kind of get her confidence up and break down those inhibitions that are going to make her nervous. Have you ever heard of people drinking alcohol because they're taking the stress off, or they've had a tough day? They're gonna break down their inhibitions. I mean, that's what it means. So people would use marijuana to give them more confidence, because I know I won't put you on the spot, but people, you ever heard the old, you know, I'm gonna have a glass of loudmouth? You know, the most quiet person in the world has 3 or 4 beers, and pretty soon they're not even their same person. They're telling stories and they're talking to people and they're doing stuff they never would do, because it's broken down their inhibitions and given them more confidence. And that's what marijuana did at the time, probably still does today. Now, in the day, and it probably hasn't changed, I'm not on the scene, but marijuana was usually smoked 2 different ways. It was rolled into cigarettes, or it was smoked through what they called a bong. Now, if you laugh, that means you might know what one is, so keep it to yourself. Again, I'm probably hitting the modern time, but it's usually smoked, or rolled in a cigarette, or smoked in a bong. So, there's your marijuana. That was one drug that was used. Now, marijuana is not a drug that in the research that I know, is not a drug that makes you violent, however, though, does it? It really doesn't. Usually it does not make you violent, okay? There's always that argument about legalizing marijuana, because probably less lives were ruined by the use of marijuana than drinking alcohol. Alcohol leads to a lot of crazy stuff. People aren't themselves, okay? That will kind of take us to, because alcohol can be kind of, in a way, a hallucinogenic drug to a point where it breaks down inhibitions. You're not yourself, but it's not a big hallucination. But the drug that caused tremendous hallucinations in the 1960s was LSD, or lysergic acid dithylamide. And we'll just call it LSD from this point. But LSD was a very popular hallucinogenic drug in the 1960s. It was very, very popular. It was colorless, it was tasteless, it was odorless, it was in liquid form. You never could really sense, it's not like you could give an LSD test and figure out if anybody had taken any. If you watched their behavior afterwards, you probably could tell something was up. But LSD was a very popular hallucinogenic drug in the 1960s. It was colorless, it was tasteless, it was odorless, and it came in a liquid form. Anybody know how you get a hallucination with LSD? Anybody ever heard of that? It involves serotonin in a person's brain. Do you know what that is? Are you biology people, or what is it? What's serotonin in your brain? Controls your nerve. What? Yeah, controls your nerve impulses in your brain. And what LSD did is it inhibited the action that serotonin had in a person's brain. It would inhibit the nerve impulses to the brain tissue. Okay, that's what it did. And if you took LSD, you'd take sometimes the trip of a lifetime. And not everybody was affected by it the same way. It affected different people in different ways, so there was no consistency to the high that a person was going to receive on this. One person might act this way, one person may act this way. It was very unpredictable. Now LSD would act somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes from the time it was taken, and its effects would last at least 8 hours, 8 to 10 hours, and in some cases several days. So it was different in every single person depending on their serotonin brain consistency. So it usually took 30 to 60 minutes to get it going on you. And it usually lasted somewhere between 8 and 10 hours, but some people lasted several days, which wasn't good. And here are 5 symptoms. Here are 5 symptoms that would occur in people if they used LSD. 5 symptoms. One symptom of the use of LSD would be mood shifts, where you may be very happy one minute and very sad the next, or very sad one minute, very happy the next, depending on the hallucination that you were having on it. So mood shifts. There are a lot of time distortions and space distortions. Losing track of time and the distance between Josh and I might seem a long ways away or real close from right here, depending on how the drug was affecting you. So there were time distortions and space distortions. LSD also resulted in, number 3, some real quick impulse behavior. What's impulse behavior, Mr. Pete? Like it's all of a sudden, boom, you do something. All of a sudden you yell, or all of a sudden you come at someone, or all of a sudden you start laughing, just out of nowhere. Impulse behavior. Okay? It also, it had people in certain cases that made people very paranoid or suspicious of any intentions and motives of those around them. So I might be on LSD and I'm watching Maddie write these notes down, and I have this thought in my mind that she's going to take that pen and plunge it into my chest. I mean, you get very suspicious of people around you. You wonder about their motives. You get real paranoid of people around you and what they're going to do. Which leads to number 5, which might be, if I think she's going to plunge that pin into my chest, I might get very aggressive towards her. Okay? So it really led to a lot of aggressive behavior. And again, it all depended on how it would affect each individual's brain system, so to speak. Now, this was developed accidentally by a Swedish scientist by the name of Albert Hofmann, who's on your ID sheet. LSD was discovered accidentally by a Swedish scientist by the name of Albert Hofmann. And as he discovered his accident and began to study his accident, he ended up going on his first LSD trip. Okay? So as he discovered this accident and began to study his accident, he eventually went on his first LSD trip. And that happened on April 16th of 1943. April 16th of 1943. How did he get on his trip? What caused him to go on his trip? Well, actually it absorbed into his skin. It absorbed into his skin. Okay? And all of a sudden, that evening, he started feeling pretty strange. Okay? Because he didn't know what had happened. And he thought he had the flu, so he went home after work and went directly to bed. So he gets this accidentally absorbed into his skin. He doesn't feel very good. He feels really kind of strange. He thinks he has the flu. He gets home and goes to bed. Well, he begins to hallucinate, and he hallucinates in bed for several hours. And when he woke up, in his case, he felt reborn. Had a great feeling after he went through his hallucination. That was how it affected him. So the next day, after hallucinating for several hours on his first LSD trip on an accident, he felt reborn. So he continued to experiment with it, and he experienced some good trips, and he experienced some bad trips. And he referred to his discovery after having some bad trips as his problem child. Okay? So after continuing his experimenting on this drug, he has some good trips, he has some not so good trips, and realizes that what he has discovered is a problem child. Anybody know how LSD was first introduced in the United States? You know what organization first introduced it when they discovered it? The CIA. The CIA. When they discovered LSD, they were the ones that first introduced it to the United States. What'd they use it for? Or tried to use it for? What's that? Confessions, interrogations. They used it as a truth serum, thinking that